This is Jeff Spittler, November 28th, 1999, A Tale of Two Kingdoms, number 3. Good morning. Let me start with a couple announcements. First of all, a few people have asked about my notes. If you're really interested, you let me know by email. I'll email you my notes for what they're worth. I don't want to put them up on the web. They're not very complete or distributable, but a few of you have asked, so if you're interested, let me know and I can send them to you by email. Okay, I'm going to try to leave some more time for questions today. I don't know if that really should be an announcement. I was going to say stop me at 10:30, but I really want to get to the end of my material, so. Okay, this is the class today. It's titled The Dawning of the Reformation in Scotland, Part 2. Since we didn't finish it last week, and we'll probably have a full class today. So when we left off last time, the castle at St. Andrews, which had been held by the Protestant party, had been captured by the French, had been reduced partly to rubble by cannon fire, and they ended up surrendering. They were promised that they would have safe conduct to some other country, to France or to another country. That turned out to be a lie. They put a number of the men in prison. They put some in service on the galleys, and John Knox was one of the men in the galleys. So let's see. Following that, this was the summer of 1547. In September of 1547, the English invaded Scotland. They were fighting both the Scots and the French. And remember, Mary of Guise was a French woman by birth, and brothers of the princes of Lorraine. And she had a number of state officers who were French, and there were a number of French troops on Scottish soil. So the international politics are somewhat beyond the scope of our discussion, and probably somewhat beyond the scope of my understanding. But we could just say that both England and France were long-time enemies. Still are, maybe. But they both desired control of Scotland. I think perhaps in the French case it was maybe more just to annoy the English than anything else. But nevertheless, there are all these international politics going on. Right. In fact, marrying Mary of Guise into the Scottish royal family would, be part of the politics. Okay, so the English, the reasons they invaded, are a bit complicated. There still may have been some hope that they could enforce this marriage treaty with Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a very young girl at the time. I guess she would have been 4 years old. To enforce that treaty between her and Edward VI. But in any case, they decided, the Scots sent her to France. Yes, Rob? Yes, who is Mary of Guise? She was the wife of James V. Okay, she was sort of the Queen of Scotland. Her husband had been the king. She wasn't the queen in the sense that she didn't have the right to rule the kingdom, but she was still active in politics and so on. And actually, she's going to come up quite a bit today. But she was, again, French by birth, part of the French royal family, had married in. This was actually her second marriage, but she'd married James V. He died, leaving. She gave him one heir, who was Mary, Queen of Scots, in I think 1543, roughly. At least she was 5 in July of 1548, so I guess she was born in 1543. So she was Mary, Queen of Scots' mother. Again, she was French by birth. She spoke broken English, supposedly. I know when Knox, well, no, I take that back. When, at least when the Protestant nobles went to all the reports of their conversations, and I'm going to read some quotes from her today, you'll see her English is a bit broken. So, again, since she wasn't, this being French by birth wasn't just some interesting fact about her. In fact, she was actively involved in all these international politics. So I don't know if that's answered your question or not.
It does.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
James V was the king of England.
No, James V was the king of Scotland.
He ruled from where? Where was it?
Well, he had a number of them, but I guess Edinburgh is the capital city. Yes, that's right. I mean, he had a number of castles. It seemed like most of the court activities happened in Edinburgh. Although, because the church was so powerful, a number of things also happened. They were sort of headquartered at St. Andrews. So, okay. So they sent Mary, again, Mary, who will be Queen of Scots. She was sent to France in July of 1548, and she didn't return to Scotland until she was 12. And when she was in France, she was raised in the Guise family household. And again, this may seem insignificant, but let's see, this is a quote from Knox. She was educated at the most dissolute court in Europe under the influence of her uncles, the Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine, of Diana of Poitiers, the French king's mistress, and of her future mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, who all, to licentious lives and habitual disregard for truth and the sacredness of human life, joined cruel persecution of reformed opinions, persecution which had the avowed object not of conversion but of extermination. And so this was, and you'll see later on that these people, Catherine de' Medici was, known for her ruthlessness. The place where Mary, Queen of Scots was raised was, the kind of training you'd want for someone to be, a tyrant, basically. So that, it's not. You'll see later on the Scots had some resentment towards this sort of French control, and taking their future queen to France was, a way of partly of controlling them. So, okay, well, at this point, we're in, say, 1548, 1547. We'd like to sort of follow the events actually in at least 4 kingdoms. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to sort of follow the path of John Knox, who's very instrumental in the Scottish Reformation. And that will take us to France, England, Germany, and Switzerland. And we'd like to follow events in England and events in Scotland. So I've tried to sort of go roughly chronologically, but we'll jump around a bit. And again, if you have questions about the facts, who was Mary of Guise or so on, just that'd be fine to stop and ask. So, but we could skip the questions about why, or if you want to argue about political theory or something, then save that for the end, okay? Yeah, when I will conveniently run out of time. Okay, so John Knox was sent into service as a slave in the French galleys in 1547. I believe he should have been 41 or 42. He was born in 1505, to the best of my knowledge, although the reason I'm a bit unsure is that I see a more recent biographer put 1515. I don't know if that's just an error or if there's some doubt about it, but the biographers of the 19th century seem to be quite sure he was born in 1505. So he would have been 41 or 42 years old, which is kind of old, approaching that age rather rapidly myself, to be being held in chains, fed poorly, and being made to row this ship around. And also he had to endure the treatment of which the French dished out to those they considered heretics. So they didn't treat them these slaves very respectfully. They thought they were these heretics that were worth, should be burned, but maybe instead of burning, we'll just let them row us around. But, yeah. So one of the things they did is two of the French officers brought in this finely painted wooden statue of the Virgin Mary called Notre Dame, Our Lady. And the French officers, they demanded that, now Knox doesn't say it was him, but generally he just says this happened to one of the men, but generally it's assumed that it was actually him. They tried to make him kiss the idol, and he refused. He said that such idols were a curse. So they apparently shoved the statue into his face, whereupon he grabbed the statue and threw it overboard. And he said, "Let Our Lady now save ourselves. She is light enough. Let her learn to swim." So, and apparently after that they weren't forced to kiss the statue anymore. They apparently did get the statue back, but they did get it. They did get it back. Well, it was wooden, so it floated. Okay. Okay, Knox was released in February of 1549, and the reasons are very unclear. There's a whole bunch of theories as to why he was released. You think about all the international power politics, and certainly if the French could have foreseen what John Knox would do in the future, you'd think they would never release that guy, but they did. There's various theories, including their ship was actually captured by the English. In that case, they didn't willfully release him. McCree thinks probably that it was the comparative indifference with which he and his brethren were now regarded by the French court, who, having procured the consent of Parliament of Scotland to the marriage of Queen Mary to the Dauphin, that would be their prince, and obtained possession of her person, she'd been moved to France, felt no longer any inclination to revenge the quarrels of the Scottish clergy. So maybe at this point they thought they'd basically achieved victory in the future and didn't need to worry about it. When he was released, he went directly to England. Henry VIII had died in 1547, and when Henry VIII was alive, even though he declared himself to be king, declared himself to be king over the church, the head of the church, he somewhat restrained the Reformation. He didn't allow things to change too much. But when Edward VI became king, he was 9 years old, and his advisors were actually very sympathetic to the Reformation, and some of the hierarchy in the church that was sympathetic started trying to reform things in a hurry. So one of these people would be Archbishop Cranmer. He was zealous in promoting the Reformation, but there was quite a bit of dead weight in the church. A lot of monks and priests who were in the church who really, they might give lip service to Protestantism, but they really remained popish Catholic at heart. So Cranmer, he attempted to get around this part, as an expedient measure of appointing preachers that were, Orthodox men that would serve sort of as itinerant preachers, and they preached. He also brought in Protestants to teach at Oxford and Cambridge. But when Knox came to England, he was immediately tapped to start preaching, and he was appointed to preach in the north of England in Berwick, and he even preached in Newcastle. So while he was there, he preached continuously. But keep in mind, there was also still this official Church of England hierarchy, and a lot of the people in it were not sympathetic to the Reformation. So he had some high-profile disputes and some debates with the hierarchy in the church. Knox did. Including some, written debates and I guess oral type debates. Knox also served as a consultant in the revision of the Book of Common Prayer. He was appointed Rob.
Knox came back to Scotland?
He came back to England, not to Scotland.
The Reformation is not in Scotland.
Certainly the Reformation wasn't looked upon favorably at that time in Scotland. So
that makes sense, because Scotland, they've always, the history here prior to this was that the reason why they aligned with the French was because Scotland was independent of England, almost at all costs.
Yeah. In fact, you'll see. I won't bring this out too much, but there's a number of cases in which things sort of change in Scotland, sort of opposite to the way they change in England. So, in fact, when Mary Tudor becomes Queen of England and starts persecuting Protestants, the Scots actually take a little bit more relaxed view, strangely enough. But in any case, he went back to England, and he was a chaplain to King Edward. He was also offered a position in London at All Hallows Church, and he declined it due to the state of the English church. He didn't feel like he could join, completely as the English church. And the fact that he refused it was a source of consternation to the Privy Council, the king's advisors. And they called him in to explain his position. And, after some argument, they basically agreed to disagree. He didn't fully approve of the church in England, but he was willing to preach. Unfortunately, but in God's providence, Edward VI died in July of 1553. Now, he had named Lady Jane Grey, who was a second cousin to Henry VIII, and a Protestant, to be his successor. And he died at 15. He didn't leave any heirs, and there were basically no other, sort of available males close to the, in close line of succession. So, Lady Jane Grey was queen for all of 9 days, and see, Simon, have you ever been to Bradgate Park in Leicestershire? Yeah. Yeah, when we lived in England, the park, there was a park just south of the town that we lived in, Loughborough, and it was actually where she lived. And supposedly all the trees there, they're all like cut at the top, so they look very funny. And they claim that they cut them that way when she was beheaded. So they cut the tops of the trees off in the morning. Anyways, Mary Tudor, who was a daughter of Henry VIII by his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, she marched into London, was proclaimed queen, and she was a devout Catholic. She was known as Bloody Mary. She really persecuted Protestants extremely, or in extreme measures. So she initially said that she would allow freedom of conscience and so on, and her intention wasn't to persecute the Reformed Christians. But she, within say 5 months, she revived the heresy laws. By the 20th of December, 1553, Protestant worship was banned. She executed a large number of Protestants, including Archbishop Cranmer, both at high levels and low levels. And now Knox's enemies, right, the people he had disputed with and so on, they were now backed by the government, and they started looking for some reason to seize him. And as they got closer, Knox's wife's relations, and I guess I haven't mentioned this, but he married a woman from Berwick, and they persuaded him to leave the country, and so he sailed for France, and he arrived in the port of Dieppe on the 20th of January, 1554. Well, John Knox made his way to Geneva, right, and he visited, met with John Calvin. They formed a pretty close friendship, and he spent some time studying in Geneva. He learned Hebrew there, even though at that time he was nearly 50 years old. So there's hope for some of us yet who, aspire to learning other languages, Greek or Hebrew, even though we're not youngsters. In any case, he was called in November of 1554. He was called to a church of English Protestants in Frankfurt, Germany.
This Knox has never been seminary trained, or how far have you gotten through the university, I guess, at this time? I sort of thought he already had the languages down and so on.
Well, there's actually no. He apparently had Greek.
He wasn't old.
Yeah, he was. He was born to a regular family. He, in fact, I don't believe in Scotland at the time there was anyone that knew Hebrew, and there was. I don't know if I've mentioned it or not, but there were, even some people who taught, like some lords had, they had brought in tutors from the continent to teach, say, Greek. In other words, Greek and Hebrew, they weren't widely available skills like today. You could go to a lot of different seminaries, and learn Greek and Hebrew. It wasn't available in Scotland in the middle of the 16th century. In terms of actually what his training was, it's really unclear. I think it's said that he was a priest, but I don't think he talks about it in his, Reformation in Scotland, about his own history. So I'm not sure really all that much is really known about what sort of training he actually had.
Did you say he was a guard?
No, I didn't say he was a guard.
Oh, he was with someone.
Oh, well, I guess you could call him a guard. Yeah, he traveled with George Wishart, right, who we talked about last week, a Protestant preacher from England. Yeah, and he did carry a sword, yes. So in that sense, he was a guard.
Okay.
So.
But he was cast primarily because of his preaching skilled? I mean, was he a great preacher? How did he get
to there?
Hold it. My wife read the book.
I am reading. I have not.
Oh, we have an authority here in the audience. Just a second, let me get the microphone over here.
What I read was he studied, his scholars he studied law, and he was a lawyer. When he decided to...
Was it?
Who was it he was protecting? He was guard?
This is George Wishart.
Yeah, and studying under him was when he began to get interested in geology.
Yeah.
He was not really interested in geology at that point.
I don't know. I mean, there's really not, as far as I know, there's not that much known exactly how he came into the Reformed faith. So, and I think he does mention leaving the puddle of papistry or something at one point.
Now, it should be mentioned that if you studied to be a lawyer, I mean, there wasn't a vast difference necessarily between studying to be a lawyer and studying to be a theologian. The Middle Ages university was centered on the Bible, much more so than today, which is quite specialized.
I just want to note here that if I don't get done by 10:30, it's not just because I was talking. You know? Okay, that's true. That's true that the education, even if you were a lawyer, would have been it would have been a classical education, right? And so it would have been largely the same as in many respects the theological education. So. Yeah, but I don't know, and it's not, Knox often even when he talks, apparently is talking about himself, he often uses a third person. And he doesn't always say, like the incident of the Virgin Mary statue, he doesn't say it was him, but everybody thinks it was, so I don't know. But in any case, he was called to this church to pastor them. But interestingly enough, after a few months, some problems arose. And there were, for lack of a better word, there were some troublemakers in the English congregation. They were meeting in a church of French Protestants, and they had agreed to use the same worship style, which had been a very plain worship style.
I'm still in Geneva.
You're still in Geneva? He was called by a group of English Protestants. No, to Frankfurt.
Oh, okay, we're in Frankfurt. Okay.
Yeah, we're in Frankfurt now. Sorry. Frankfurt on Main, in Germany. Yeah, okay. Well, I'll tell Elder Noel that we need a whiteboard in here with a map. And anyways, they'd agreed to this very simple worship style, but some, as basically English Protestants kept coming to, they kept leaving the country because Mary of Tudor was persecuting them. Some came in that had been like in the English church, and they wanted, the sort of high church worship style. And some of them played a lot of, political games, and eventually the local magistrate asked Knox to leave. So this was in March of 1555. So he was just there for 4 months. He went back to Geneva. Okay, so if I were telling this story to my children, I'd ask them, well, what do you suppose that he wanted to do now? He'd been to Frankfurt, he came back. Well, I say he desired to return to Scotland, of course, but actually first he went to see his wife, who was still in Berwick, England. So he, well, let's see, I'll come back to that in a minute. Now I'll go back to what happened in Scotland after he left. Well, the church kept persecuting Christians. They exiled some, they seized others' properties, they kept burning some at the stake. It wasn't really, in terms of burning at the stake, it wasn't large numbers, but they were still persecuting Christians there. They kept trying to reform themselves. And when the Roman Church tried to reform itself, generally what they were trying to do was reform these sort of gross practices that we talked about, like clerical concubinage and so on. At one of these councils that I mentioned last week in 1551, they actually they boasted they had succeeded in extirpating the heresy, in other words, Reformed theology from the land. But of course, there were still believers there, but there weren't any public teachers. And this went on until about 1554. In 1554, Mary of Guise, who again was the queen but without any any power, she kept manipulating things, and she eventually worked her way up to become the regent of Scotland. So we had the Earl of Arran, who was initially favorable to the Reformation. Then he got under some pressure from various people and sort of went the other way. Well, she used quite a bit of political, behind-the-scenes, backroom type negotiating, and she got the Earl of Arran to resign and appointed him to be the Duke of. This is French, so it looks like Châteauroux. But in any case, he gave up the regency, and in order to do this, she also made some concessions to the Protestants. So she used them as one of her bit players to help become regent. And because, and again, as I mentioned earlier, there always seems to be this sort of polarity between England and Scotland. Mary Tudor was persecuting Christians there. Some of them were fleeing Scotland at the same time. And because she was trying to give some concessions to the Protestants, they were left to teach relatively undisturbed. So we started to see basically some more public teaching of Reformed theology in Scotland. Okay, so Knox set out for England, to Berwick, where his wife resided, and he spent some time there, and he went to Edinburgh then. I mean, even though she was persecuting Christians, I mean, this is all clandestine. His presence hadn't been advertised in England. Well, he went to Scotland. He planned to make only a short visit. But once he arrived, people pressed him into preaching. He was generally preaching in private houses, but because of this, he had to preach in sort of multiple services. So he was doing all this repetitive, he'd preach a sermon, I suppose the same sermon multiple times to cover all the people who wanted to hear it. Spent a lot of time advising people, giving them private instruction, answering questions about theology and so on, much like we do here. Much like we do at Tuesday lunch. I'm sure it was just like that. Our lunch on Tuesday. Yeah, that's right. John Knox took a job somewhere else. Okay. So then he preached also in various parts of Scotland, and they took him various places, and he preached to a number of young lords, Lord Lorne, Lord Erskine, who was later Earl of Mar, Lord James Stuart. The name sounds familiar. It's because he was an illegitimate son of James V, King of Scotland. Okay, so he was, a son by one of his mistresses. He was later Earl of Moray, and he had a very influential part in the Reformation in terms of the public organization of it later on. Actually, all of these young lords did have, their names will come up again. They participated in the Reformation at various levels. Well, at first, he's preaching in private houses in more or less clandestine manner. If somebody came to my house and I invited a few over to listen to this person preach, it wouldn't necessarily come to the attention of the authorities. Right, but eventually it did. It started to become known that John Knox was preaching in Scotland, and it even became a topic of conversation at the court of the regent. There's a recorded conversation they had about somebody preaching, and finally one of the bishop was there, identified who it was. But they hadn't done anything to that point. They decided they needed to, so they called the church hierarchy, summoned John Knox to appear at the Church of the Blackfriars in Edinburgh on May 15th, 1556. But apparently they didn't actually expect him to show. I don't know. And because at this time they were still unsure of how much the regent would support them. So when he came, they had some procedural maneuver, set aside the summons, and they left. So Knox, being in Edinburgh at this church, he preached somewhere else, but he preached in Edinburgh for 11 days, like morning and afternoon, without being disturbed. And they didn't bother him. They're really afraid. They're really afraid of him. And this comes out again and again. We'll see later on. Later on, if we get that far, but it doesn't look like. It looks like we're going to have the dawning of the Reformation part 3 next week. Okay. Yes. Oh, believe me, I've left out a lot of stuff here. Okay, but sometime after that, he received another call to pastor the English congregation, this time in Geneva. And also things were sort of heating up in Scotland. He decided to leave, and as soon as he did, the church there, then they started up their proceedings again. They passed judgment against him, damning him to flames and to hell, and they burned him in effigy. Okay, but he was gone at that point.
You give us some sense as to why they were so afraid of him? I mean, it seems very strange. Here's this guy that he sneaks into town, he's preaching in these houses. So what? I mean, I guess I don't quite see where.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have an army. He has no royal, lineage that's going to push him to the top.
Yeah, why were they so...
Even with this groundswell of popular support, or...
Yeah. Their fear of him is greatly, is not exaggerated. They had every reason to fear him. And you'll see in a few years when he returns to Scotland after going to Geneva, they literally panic. And there is a groundswell of Reformation and destruction of icons. It literally throws all these people out of their comfortable livings. I mean, their whole world is basically destroyed in 3 years. 3 years from the time we're talking about. And I mean, there's a lot of people. So they were trying, I believe, to cut off the heads, right? The people that were promoting this heresy and so on. They were trying to strike them. I mean, they had a little hope of rounding up everybody who had some kind of reformed thinking in their heads, right? But the public preachers, they were trying to round up. Mr. Brucato.
It could be. I mean, there could be a lot of answers to that question. But one thing to keep in mind is the French rulers are basically foreigners at this moment in time.
Yeah.
I mean, so Scotland, the only reason why Scotland allied itself with France was to remain independent of England.
Yeah. Right, and they didn't always, they kind of fluctuated back and forth. Okay, I wasn't going to bring this up, but since the questions come up, and since we're clearly not going to make it finish today. Yeah, I know. It's probably going to have to wait till next week, but let's see. This is a bit earlier, but just talking about the difference internationally here about the Reformation. So several German princes and also the kings of Denmark and Sweden were giving their protection to Lutheranism and were appropriating ecclesiastical wealth. Okay, so these guys, saw the Reformation. I mean, they may have been reformed themselves or maybe not. They may have just seen it as an opportunity to get back some of this wealth the church had accumulated. Okay, but the Scottish government in 1527 expressed its preference for supporting orthodoxy at a price.
Orthodoxy meaning the Catholic.
The Roman Catholic Church. Opposition to the Reform movement must be rewarded by favors from the church. So, in other words, I mean, you can look at it as this is the Reformation's opportunity to confiscate a bunch of the church's property, or fighting the Reformation as a way to get the church to pay you back with a lot of favors. Now, again, as Rob said, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, and I don't,
So was the church basically run by foreigners in Scotland?
No, the church wasn't run by foreigners. I mean, well, it was run by the Pope, but I mean, a lot of the church hierarchy were people from Scotland. So that's, I don't think that's the problem so much as that they had gotten themselves into a position where they accumulated just vast amounts of wealth. We have another statement from the audience here. Go ahead.
Also, as far as the church was very instrumental in helping the Scottish lords in terms of winning their independence from England. So, but throughout all of Europe, the church had become corrupt, and it was universally recognized that the church was corrupt, from within and from without. You had this conciliatory movement, which went on in Europe, and this just kind of beyond the scope of it.
Yeah, no, but it is true that even within the church, we probably won't get that far today, but they had yet another one of these councils where the Protestants came in and they had a paper with showing what they thought should be done to reform the church. to reform the existing church. And at the same time, party within the church had a paper, not exactly along the same lines, but along, some of the same things, that needed to be done to reform the church. Right, but they're, if you're living the life of a prince, with how mistresses and, enormous wealth and so on, do you want to give it up? Just because somebody, some weenie, wants to have faith in the Bible. I mean, I've never even read the Bible. Why would I? Why? I mean, that's true. I mean, they were literally some of them had never even looked at one. Okay, let's continue on. While Knox was in Geneva this time, he worked on an English translation of the Bible, the Geneva Bible, right? So hence our New Geneva Study Bible. Incidentally, getting off track here, the authorized version that the King James version, right? It was to replace the Geneva Bible, which King James claimed was really the poorest translation he'd ever read. But I believe what he really didn't like were all the notes that went with the Geneva Bible. So, yeah, that's what he did. He got rid of the notes. Well, we'll come to that in probably maybe a year and a half or so. He didn't like the notes because they weren't favorable to rule by bishops, which were controlled by the king. Okay, Knox kept corresponding regularly with the brethren in Scotland. I thought about reading some parts from some of his letters, but we probably won't get to that. He published several treatises, one of which is known as, and I think you've probably heard this title before, The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Okay.
He's talking about the queens.
It was overall aimed at demonstrating that women reigning is unbiblical in nature. Okay, and that was his primary goal. But it was particularly aimed at Mary Tudor, who sat on the throne of England and persecuted Protestants. But later on, both Elizabeth I, who was a Protestant, and Mary Queen of Scots took a fair amount of umbrage at this document. So, okay, in the meantime, in Scotland, the Reformation proceeded on, unabated, and usually I just try to press forward with more material, but sensing that there may be more questions and discussion today, why don't we pause here and give an opportunity for some further discussion and questions, if you haven't got them all out of your system already. Any questions?
So in Scotland, right, Knox was gone. All the Reformation leadership has been killed or driven out of the country. What's fueling this continued? What's keeping it going?
Well, that's my next part. Actually, is what's keeping it going. I mean, there were basically at various times, even when we officially had this Roman Church, there were times when the rulers' attitudes toward the Protestants sort of softened and they made concessions. And so at one point they kept preachers in their houses. So the nobles that were Protestants basically had little churches, preaching stations in their houses. And this really irritated the Roman church hierarchy. That these various nobles kept these, Protestant preachers, in their houses and were protecting them, because they still, even as late as 1558, they executed another Protestant, a guy who was 82 years old, Walter Milne. Again, we'll come to that next week, I guess.
So if they didn't have a protector, then they were in trouble.
Right, or if some of these guys like Walter Milne apparently, just operated clandestinely, much like a house church movement anywhere, that we hear about in communist China or something. They very quiet about their activities. Mike. What was happening with Germany at this time with Lutheranism? Well, I don't know that I can give you a really good answer on.
It was a lot.
Yeah. Well, Germany, of course, wasn't one country, right? It was a series of baronies. So, but it had taken. I mean, a number of them were officially Lutherans. So.
Luther was in favor of a national church.
So they had
And nobody at this time envisioned a state without a church. So the question would be, is there some legitimacy to the Catholic concern of everybody doing or believing the dictates of their conscience, which was basically Luther's answer, or reported answer, at the Diet of Worms, as opposed to respecting ecclesiastical and civil authority. I mean, these nobles were basically rebelling by keeping Protestant. So what would stop them from keeping Muslim preachers?
Yeah, but to some degree, but yeah. Well, no, I agree with that. That there's still the issue of establishment, and so on. Still is a question that in America we took a completely different course. In most of Europe, they have established churches, but they're, I don't know, for the most part, they're pretty pathetic. So.
But they weren't necessarily in Germany at this point in time.
No.
National churches were actually started off on a good footing.
Right.
But because it's not the right answer, it didn't stand the test of time.
Yeah. Well, I guess that issue is going to become focused much more clearly in sort of the latter part of the class with the Covenanters.
But you would have to say that the Protestants would have got some sort of encouragement knowing that, this is going other areas.
Oh, yes. Right, yeah. And there was communication. It wasn't as if they didn't know what was going on in Europe. There was apparently quite a bit of communication. Yeah. So, interestingly, and maybe I'll just close with this, one thing about the Scottish Church is that it was forced to pretty much form itself completely anew. And for that reason, I think the answers and theology that arrived at were maybe somewhat different and more biblical than some of the other churches which were kind of converted from the existing Catholic Church. But just the way things worked out in Scotland, the Catholic Church there, it never wanted to compromise, and it finally just ended up being overrun. So, anyways, what? Oh.
I mean, did people understand, Christ said, love your enemy?
Christ said to sell your cloak and buy a sword.
Well, I'm just saying.
I'm sure he would have known that verse. No, it was a different age, certainly. There weren't, even things that might be, there were certainly things that are politically incorrect in our day weren't so.
You didn't wear WWJD.
I don't think he wore a WWJD bracelet. I did like one of the authors I was reading about some of these young lords that later on, initiated the first covenants and so on. They said they were all of the Petrine school of disciples. In other words, fought with the sword. So, anyways, let's close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for this time that we can spend, and we pray that you'd help us as we consider the history of your church to understand what was biblical and what was done, and also things that were unbiblical, Lord. And we pray that you would help us apply it to our own day, to our own church, and to our own nation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I have a question for, I really like to answer. Is not faith